Well, buenas tardes. It is afternoon here in the Seattle area, and I'm going to talk to you today about the network diagram. I've gotten some feedback from students saying that they were helpful, so I'll continue to do them as long as you're finding them useful. The first thing to do is make sure that you've read in the Verzu book, and it wouldn't hurt to read the supplemental reading either, so that you have a pretty good idea as to what a network diagram is. Basically, it just shows the flow of the project from the beginning of the project. See, up to this point, what we've done is we developed a project charter, which gave us a high level of scope. Then we did the work breakdown structure, which took us down to a much lower level, a more specific level of scope. The work packages are the things that we actually need to do in order to be able to accomplish the project, in other words, to produce the deliverable. Okay? In the RAM, we assigned resources to those work packages because the work isn't going to get done by itself. Somebody has to do it. So the RAM is the tool then that we use to identify who's going to do what. Now we're getting into the schedule. So now that we've answered the what and the who, it's now a question of when. So we're developing the project schedule, and the first step is the network diagram. Now, let me say first of all that as a practicing project manager, I'm not going to do something like this. I'm going to use some project management software, which is going to make the task very quick and easy. But the reason why we have you do this by hand is so that you can understand the basic principles behind it, particularly the concepts of sequence, the concept of float, sometimes called slack, and of course the real important aspect here of a network diagram, and that is the critical path. So we'll define those as we go along. What you're going to do is you're going to use this template, and it is required. You can do this. In fact, I might even recommend that you do it on paper or you do it in a computer first before doing the diagram, because Excel is not really ideally suited to doing network diagrams. So if you make a mistake or you want to make changes, it's a lot easier to do it on paper or in some other program. So, but this is what you need to present. Let's go over the box now. Each box represents a work package, and in the upper left it says ES. That stands for early start date. That is the earliest that you can begin that particular activity. Now, if this is the first activity, then the early start date would be the start date for the project. Okay. If this is not the first activity, if there are predecessors, that is, activities that come before this one, then the earliest start date would be when the predecessor has been completed. ID, in this, let's just number them from 1 to whatever. We won't worry too much about. All the ID really does is that it helps us go to identify a particular activity. So if there's any questions, you can say go to ID 7. Normally when I'm doing this on a computer, I'll use the WBS number, but let's just keep it simple here and just start with 1 and go through until you're done. The next is duration. And we're going to talk more about duration later, but in this particular case, why don't you just use the duration for the activity that you used in your RAM assignment. So you'll put in the duration, and then LS is late start. In other words, what's the latest you can start an activity without delaying its successor, that is, the activity that comes afterwards. Now, for most activities, early late start and late finish are going to be the same, and early start and early finish will be the same dates. But it is possible that the early finish and the late finish might be different than the early start and the late start. We'll see situations where that might occur later in this podcast. Here we have the task name. Here I put in the name of the task. You know, some of you have gotten feedback from me that your activity names are too long. Here perhaps you can see why, because this is a very small box. And the same is true if you are using the computer, for example. The names of activities has to be short because otherwise it gets chopped off, and if you don't recognize the first 10 or 15 letters, then you may not know exactly what activity that is. The float is a concept we haven't talked about yet. It's in your readings for this week. Essentially, it's going to be the difference between the early finish and the late finish, which is also the same as the difference between the early start and the late start. Okay, so we'll come back and talk about all of these concepts in a little while. Let's first of all see how we're going to use the template. You know, perhaps you have 25 or 30 activities, and by activities I'm referring specifically to work packages. So if you have, let's say, 25 work packages, then you're going to have 25 boxes. And then you will also have an arrow that shows the flow of the project. Let's start by putting in a second activity here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select this particular activity right here. I'm going to go up and I'm going to do a copy, and then I'm going to put it over here. I'm going to come up and I'm going to do a paste. So now we have two activities, and of course I'm going to go and fill in each one of these. Now when we're doing this, by the way, I do have a link to a YouTube podcast that talks about how you calculate early start, early finish, late finish, and the float. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing that here. I'll let you view that video, which I think explains it very clearly. In any case, we now have two activities. Let's make this one number 1 and this one number 2. How am I going to link the two? Well, excuse me. Let's come in under shape. I'm going to select an arrow, and now your version of Excel might be a little bit different, but I think based on this you can figure out that it's really not that hard to do. And perhaps then let's go ahead and put in one more. Let's put this one down here. Okay, and let's do another. So you get the idea here. Now, one of the reasons why I suggested that you do this on paper or in a computer first is simply because these things are difficult to move around. You can't just drag it and move it somewhere else. If I want to move this up one, essentially what I have to do is to excuse me, my throat's gone a little dry. Essentially what I can do here is I can copy this. I can then clear it, Oops, let me. Oops, clear all. I didn't select the whole thing, so let's go back and do it again and come here to clear all. And then I can move this up, go back and do the paste, and I should be able to move that up. Okay, that's really about all there is to it. And once I would suggest putting in all the boxes. You can put in the IDs, put in the names, and then go back once you've got these all in and you've got the arrows in the right place, which we call dependencies. Then you can start with the early start dates and the early finish dates because those are easy. What is the only really difficult part of this entire exercise is calculating the late start and the late finish. Excuse me. And the video on YouTube does a very good job of explaining how you do a forward pass and a backward pass to get the early start, the late start, early finish, and late finish. Let me just talk very briefly before closing about a couple of common problems. Probably the most obvious one would be miscalculations. That would certainly be one. When you're done, what you'll need to do is identify the critical path. And there are a number of different ways in which you can do that. You could go back in, for example, if this is on the critical path, you could come in here and see if we could change the color on this one. I haven't worked with Excel in a while, but that's one option. Another option could be under Notes. We're not going to use the Notes field for this exercise, is to fill that, and I guess, and we could do that with a red rather than a yellow. But that would indicate then that it would be on the critical path. See if we can come in here. There we go. So there are a number of different ways in which you can do it, but misspecification of the critical path is a common error. Another one is what I call dangling work packages, and that is you have a work package that's on a path, and all of a sudden it peters out. It stops. The rule here is essentially that every activity, every work package except the very first one has to have a predecessor. And every activity except the last one has to have a predecessor. Let me see if I said that right. The very first is the only one that has no predecessor, and the last one is the only one that doesn't have a successor, that is one that follows afterwards. Sometimes it gets a little confusing between predecessor and successor, but predecessor comes before, successor comes afterwards. So the first one has no predecessor, the last activity has no successor. Every other activity, except for those two, has to have both a predecessor and a successor, both. Okay. In fact, I brought up the YouTube video, and we can see perhaps a little bit about how that works here. There we go. Here's the example in the YouTube video that I put the link to, and you'll notice that every activity has a predecessor except this one, and every one has a successor except for this last one. You'll notice the boxes are also a little bit different. There's a legend down here. They put the ID here. The ID in your template is over here, so be aware that it's a little bit different, but it's essentially the same. And in this video, they'll kind of walk you through how you fill out the early start, the early finish, late start, and late finish. And once you've got that down, then you can go through your own template and fill in that information. Well, I think that pretty well covers it. As I said, this is not a hard exercise, but it is a little bit complicated, and there are a number of calculations, so double check yourself because it is easy to make a mistake. But I think if you follow the guidelines that I've laid out here and those in the video, I think that you should be in pretty good shape. So I wish you all the best of luck, and hopefully I'll see at the end of the week some really good network diagrams.